you might have to share.
Okay, good afternoon, everyone. Good afternoon, everyone. I think everyone is ready. The technology is working. We have Aroma online, so welcome to this session on connecting climate change, biodiversity and land for city-region resilience. My name is Bernard Barth. I lead UN Habitat's climate change work, and this session lies very much at the core of a new emerging work mandate of UN Habitat as we launch an office in Montreal that will provide urban climate change and biodiversity solutions. This session at the Global Innovation Hub brings together a fantastic panel of speakers, and together we are of course working now on those issues, and we've had interesting conversations to start with on how to link really the biodiversity, the climate change and the land management or financing through land mechanisms. We have different entry points today, and hopefully have enough time for a conversation to dig a little bit deeper with you. Besides convening stakeholders here in this meeting, of course, we also hope to identify research and innovation needs to address the specific needs at the city level, but also globally to shape the agenda as we see the convergence of the three Rio conventions. Happy to be here with like-minded stakeholders, but of course we also hope to bring out controversial views and questions here. I am happy to welcome, yes, he's behind me, Aroma Ravi, who probably doesn't need much of an introduction. Aro is the director of the Indian Institute for Human Settlements. He is an IPCC author through the 5th and the 6th cycle. And he is a co-chair of the UN Sustainable Development Solutions Network. His research and practice lies at the interface of sustainability and climate science and emerging urban science. Of course, Aro has been a key driver also of the urban climate change agenda as a co-author of the Summary for Urban Policymakers of the IPCC report. I just would like to very briefly mention who else we have on this panel, but I will introduce the panelists as we introduce their short interventions. We have Jane, who sits next to me. Jane Engel is the mission co-holder of Dark Matters Lab. Then we have Joanne Masic, who is the lead urban specialist and global lead at the World Bank. We have then Helen Wanjohi, who is with the World Resource Institute on Resilience African Cities. And last but not least, we have Paul Curry, the Director of Urban Systems from ICLE Africa. Aro, the floor is yours to please frame this session on integrated approaches to combine biodiversity, land, and climate responses at the city-region scale. But can the technology put on the screen so we can see Aro? No? Good. Then the floor is yours, Aro.
Thanks, Bernard. I hope you can hear me, even if you can't see me, because I'm sitting behind you. So it's a pleasure to be there. Apologies that I couldn't be there in person, but this is a very important theme. But I'd start by being, fairly frank. So the Holocene is clearly over. The Holocene is not only clearly over, but we are now headed either for 1.5 or a 2 degree Celsius overshoot. And that is because of a number of reasons. But one of the reasons is really the coupling of human systems and particularly cities with natural systems. So I think the core question that we have to address at the moment in this context, that is, like I said, we're deep into the Anthropocene. The impacts are being felt across the world, certainly more significantly in urbanized or urbanizing regions. The reason for that is fairly simple. About 100 years ago, we had 1.2 billion people. Now we have only close to 8 billion, and more than half of them are in cities. So cities are driving a lot of what we see on the development front in terms of income growth, wealth, new technologies, etc. But they also concentrate other things which are of deep concern. And I guess consumption, risk are concentrated in cities. And the most obvious thing when it comes to the territorial agenda is that cities across the world, at least as they've been constructed in the 20th century, driven by fossil fuels and fossil water, actually are unable to, or in some cases unwilling to, provide for themselves in terms of basic, ecosystem services. I mean, in some senses, cities will never be able to provide for themselves, but their own relationships with their embedding regions, with sort of global trade, which then draws in resources in some of the greater sort of urban clusters across the world, pretty much from across the world, means very, very simply that as far as food is concerned, as far as most of the fibers, at least the natural fibers are concerned, and both air and water-based ecosystem services, cities actually cannot cope with themselves. So it's inevitable, both for the survival of urban cultures across the world and to deal with, in a sense, the core crisis that we are facing today, whether it's poverty and inequality at one end, the climate crisis, but more deeply, the ecosystems crisis, or more specifically, the biodiversity crisis or the collapse that we're starting to see across the world. We really need to reimagine the relationship, which was seen earlier as a city in the countryside, but basically it is the entire support systems that keep urban culture systems alive. And it's not only the large megacities, we tend to be diverted by that, but the entire, I would say, human settlement system that goes from, at least in my country, 550,000 villages and just about 10,000 urban centers. So we have to look at the connection across the entire system, because it is from the entire landscape that we are getting the food, the water, the fiber in some cases, and in many cases, when you're looking at airsheds, the kind of air that we require to be able to just survive, if not thrive, in our urban areas. So the challenge I would imagine is that, ever since we started negotiating this thing in maybe 30 plus years ago in Rio, the core conventions were kind of tied to each other, but they were running side by side. So whether you look at the relationship between the sort of 2030 agenda and the Sendai agenda in some senses, which sat side by side, or as we've seen just now, thankfully, we have Kunming Montreal and the Paris process. The challenge for us is to try and connect them up and connect them up in space. And I think that's an operational question, which I guess those of us who work in conservation, those of us who work in territorial development or localization of the sustainable development agenda understand. And that is, solutions have to be local, because if they're not local, you can't work the integration, but they have to add up across the landscape. And I think the fundamental challenge we face in most parts of the world is really one of governance, because very often, let's say, land and land use management, what happens in terms of agricultural landscapes or even energy landscapes. Countries like Brazil, for example, have very large landscapes that are dedicated to biofuels, which are quite important to dealing with questions of climate change, but they have a significant impact on biodiversity. So the connection between what happens in the land and waterscapes, because both aquatic and marine scapes in some senses are quite important, in the convention framework, in the kind of working even within the UN system, in spite of the relationship between WMO, UNEP, and the other UN agencies and programs, is fragmented. And I think part of the real sort of opportunity we have, both at COP in the last many COPs and now, is to integrate this into the adaptation agenda, of course. But that cannot be done unless we're able to address questions that sit very firmly within the 2030 development agenda. For example, you can't address poverty, whether it's rural or urban, without looking at food security. Food security is a question of what kind of landscapes you work with and how one addresses biodiversity inside that. Because as we know, pretty much across the world, we have a crisis, not only of invasive species, we have a crisis of pollinators. And if, in fact, our work in Bangalore now shows that pollinators are actually migrating, or let's say they're more intensively, doing better in urban areas rather than in peripheral rural areas because of the extensive use of a whole range of agrochemicals to deal with, other kinds of questions. So there's a deep connection, and unfortunately, both the disciplines and the practices of dealing with urban planning, regional planning and development, and certainly much more sort of intense urban interventions are often sort of steeply divorced from what happens in the larger landscape. And even that does not adequately address questions of deeper questions of biodiversity, which I think in some senses is the most significant crisis that we'll see over the latter part of the 21st century. So taking bi-regional approaches and actually being able to deal with questions of valuation, starting many years ago, the work that was done trying to value what happened on the climate side, and then later, more recently in the Dasgupta Commission report, trying to look at the valuation of ecosystem services and biodiversity, raises some fairly fundamental questions. And I think part of the challenge we have in the policy space is our valorization and valuation systems, because they're dominated by metrics like GDP or even the Human Development Index in some senses, which doesn't adequately deal with environmental and ecological questions. In a sense, we are valuing things that in the long run become a significant issue. So if you take the framework that Piketty sort of laid out many years ago and dealt with other forms of capital, if you look at the entire sort of the hierarchy of capital, typically natural capital sits at the bottom of the ladder, where our returns on investment on natural capital are negative. They've been so because since the late 1980s and 1990s, we've been in a global deficit in terms of sort of ecological flows. A little bit higher than that is human capital, which in a sense is one of the core challenges that we have in terms of poverty, because we're not investing enough on people and institutions and communities. Above that becomes industrial capital, which is in a sense the driving factor in the climate crisis. And then way up on top, financial capital, which in a sense decides where resources will go, which is typically sometimes going against fundamental principles of conservation, fundamental principles of sustainability, as far as people are concerned and urban systems are concerned. So when we look at territorial development, I think we do need to also look at the relationships, the terms of trade between these forms of capital and the tipping points that we fairly clearly know at global scale, at least, that as far as the global tipping points are concerned, we have either crossed or approaching them. We're seeing the same thing in the climate system. And just because we're not adequately able to map that out very well in the biodiversity sphere doesn't mean that we're not going to see them future. So in the future. So it's the connection between these questions that need to be established. And the new urban agenda, which has somewhat taken a little bit of a backseat in this debate, provides us some of the frameworks for doing that. But I would say we need to really bring in the biodiversity conservation land use frame into that much more sharply. It is still fairly anthropocentric, and frankly, people and our systems that we've created, economic systems and social systems, absolutely cannot survive and will not be able to thrive unless we're able to look at the underlying biological systems that, irrespective of whatever technology we have, whether it's advanced biotechnology or new genetics or even the kind of work that we're seeing with generative AI, fundamentally, if you're going to be destroying life, and in a sense, if people own the landscape in some senses rather than the other way around, as many local and indigenous cultures have kind of arrived at after many millennia of coping with rather difficult environments, we have a challenge there. So I think there's both an intellectual challenge and there's a challenge of trying to bring these together into implementable kind of processes. I'm sitting on a campus at the moment, which is trying to do that quite at a very, very, very small scale in a large megacity. But we need multiple experiments that are ready to go to scale, I would say, in the next 5 to 10 years, because the temperature is going to rise. We're going to have increasing crisis of too much water, too little water, polluted water. And of course, sitting on top of that is the biodiversity crisis that is building and I think is ready to explode. We've seen a sort of precursor of that in the zoonospatial challenges that we've had during COVID. but that's a kind of, I would say, a wake-up call for us in some senses. So we have to really reimagine the relationship between the entire sort of settlement system across the spectrum, and also within each of those kind of levels of hierarchy in settlement systems with nature and the countryside. And of course, land is very important in it. It's not good enough to say that in the production function, land is a very small part of the process. The reason why it's so and why biodiversity is so is because we're not valuing it adequately. Our institutions are not sensitive to it. And the practitioners and the policymakers who focus on this are somewhat marginalized in the larger process. So this, as I see this moving forward, the convergence of these agendas are going to be quite important. So I think I'll leave you there. I'm hoping to hear a very sort of interesting and sharp conversation on this question. I was trying to be a little provocative in the beginning. I hope I haven't kind of exceeded my brief and my time too much. So thank you, Bernard.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Aro. I think at the front we were sitting a little bit in the valley of the deaf, but I think in the audience it was clear, and I think I managed to capture most of your intervention. And I hope, Aro, you can stay around. What we are planning on doing is to have 4 interventions of 5 minutes each, to have then also enough time for a conversation. So with that, I'm happy to introduce Jane Engel again, the mission co-leader at Dark Matters Lab. Jane, you bring 25 years of expertise in city planning, urban policy innovation, participatory research, and collaborative governance design across different continents and countries to the table here. And your experience across those regions and scale spans, of course, then from community level engagement to the policy level. So taking into account this experience, how do you think we can innovate in the governance of cities and regions?
Thanks so much for that, Bernard. And hello, everyone. It's great to be here, and especially on such an amazing panel, and also on a topic that I think is absolutely critical for our futures, to work at not only climate, biodiversity, land, water in integrated ways, but also at the scale not only of cities, but of city, and not just city regions as in metropolitan context, but as in city bioregional context. So this is absolutely critical. So delighted to have this opportunity. So I'm with Dark Matter Labs. And dark matter, in case you haven't heard of Dark Matter Labs, dark matter is very much a metaphor for that which is least seen often in society and yet affects everything. So we work on the dark matter of regulatory systems, financial systems, legal systems, and redesigning institutional mechanisms and other policy aspects around that dark matter in order to affect common good outcomes in various ways. It's what we sometimes refer to as building life-affirming economies or social bioregional economies. So what I'd like to do in just these few minutes of remarks are really 3 things. I want to ask a question, what if, to really elevate our gaze first up in terms of ambition, and also out in terms of how we think about long-term change. So not only what is the path dependency we're on in terms of status quo, but how can we actually look long term and then make changes now towards very different futures that we really need to get to. And then I'll give some examples of institutional design mechanisms that we're working on that we think can be transformational based on what we're learning now with a lot of our city and regional work, and then just a couple examples. So I'll do that quickly in just a few minutes. So first of all, what if? So what if, for example, we thought very differently about biodiversity? So how about if instead of us measuring a census of human population only, so instead of 8 billion, around 8 billion being the population, what if we counted population of keystone species in context and numbers within that as part of our annual census data? So the world would consist of trillions or quadrillions because we would be counting in terms of biodiversity. We would be monitoring and measuring. So that's a first what if, to really even shift our views of how we understand population and census and so on, and then hold us accountable to very different kinds of measures. A second one is something that I crave as a longtime city planner. A term that drives me crazy is land use planning. What if we thought in terms of land relationships? So what would land relationship planning look like? What if we saw ourselves not as in dominion all the time over land, but actually in relationships of reciprocity with the nature that we depend on for life? And how would that change the way we think about the nexus of land, water, energy, food, materials in a regional context? So how can we move towards relationships? And then a third one is something that I'm learning a lot through quite a bit of work with indigenous communities that we do, particularly where I'm based in Canada. And that is thinking about law as a verb. So in many indigenous contexts, the word law is a verb. So we law together, we do law together. And as human beings, we are all responsible to law together based on what we're seeing in the earth community and responding to change as it happens. And we're stewards of lawing together. And just by shifting that sort of gaze and understanding, it opens up a very different way of seeing and then systemically addressing how we design institutions. Quickly into some institutional mechanisms for transformation that we're designing. So a first one has to do with multi-level action. So I attended a fantastic plenary the other day about the multi-level action. It was so great to see mayors alongside national government representatives. And one of the challenges was I didn't see any indigenous nations or indigenous community representatives alongside mayors and national government representatives. I think that's going to be something, hopefully next year at COP we'll see that. So that's something we're working on in Canada. We have cohorts of municipal, indigenous, other government and civil society leaders together thinking about these futures in the long term. Just a couple of more. And one is we're designing bioregional financing facilities, again, to address the multi-capital approaches, also looking at ROI, return on investment differently. What are, in addition to finance and economic ROI, how can we think about social ROI, about nature ROI, about even inspiration ROI, and what would that look like? As well as institutions for not only rights of nature, where ecosystem have personhood under the law, like corporations do, but also beyond. What is beyond that in terms of self-sovereignty of nature and of land, and self-ownership of nature and land? And I'll close with that, which is an example of a community that we're working with in Halifax in Canada, with the Mi'kmaq Native Friendship Center, an Indigenous organization there, who has decided to undertake a process of what they call free land. So they own a parcel of land, which they actually use the same language that King Charles used in his opening talk, which is of COP this year, which was the earth doesn't belong to us, but we belong to the earth. Now, if King Charles actually meant that, that would be incredibly transformational in terms of land ownership. Our partner, our Indigenous partner, Pam Glo-Desrochers, she actually means that and wants to take land that she officially owns and put that into self-ownership of the ecosystems of the land, which again would be a transformational proof of possibility towards a very way of being in land relationship. And I could go on, but I'll stop there for now. Thanks.
Thanks, Jane. Already lots of food for thought. including, of course, unpacking some of the finance dimensions. So very happy then to introduce or reintroduce Joanna again, who has many different hats or a very long title in the World Bank, but I think for here may be important just to note the important role that Joanna plays as the lead urban specialist in cities and climate change, and in that sense, very happy to reconnect in these events and constantly work together. So in your role, of course, the financing dimension is critical, and how can we innovate in that space in terms of financing city, region scale investments for climate change, for biodiversity, and framing those big issues that we're discussing here, just more in the context of sustainability.
So thanks, Bernard, and thanks for inviting me here. I was really happy to have a session that looks at city regions, because we talk a lot about cities, but I think we don't do enough about the territory and the regional scale when we do. And not just from biodiversity side, but also, you know, they are part of urban settlements that often anchor smaller towns and cities around. And that's why from our side there, it's very important to think on a territorial scale. When it comes to finance, of course, everybody knows the types of financial instruments out there. But for many of the city regions that we work with, you know, just basic subnational finance is a challenge and needs to be sort of the anchor for any types of new financing instruments to come in. So I think we need a sort of parallel track, both on building the subnational finance in general, climate finance, to be able to introduce more sophisticated financing mechanisms. I wanted to maybe just touch on a few examples at the territorial scale, because that's what we're talking about here. First one is in the European region. They, over the last 10, 15 years, have been introducing integrated territorial investments, whereby stakeholders within regions get together with integrated packages focused on sustainability mostly, and look at financing from different European funds. And I know that now we worked closely with Bulgaria, for example, so they've tried to set up also urban regional bodies that can then prioritize those types of investments and also crowd in financing from different sources. So sort of integrating investment at a regional scale in general for sustainability. And Colombia is another example where they divided their regions into, based on function, and then identified regional bodies, and then had specific financing for priority regional projects. But they had to be prioritized and a clear link to regional targets and goals. So those are two sort of territorial examples, and I think it's good to specifically touch on land and biodiversity because it's the topic of today's discussion. But for example, we work in Indonesia, where, you know, land planning is very complicated between agriculture, customary use, forestry, growing cities. But there's a lot of overlap and lack of clarity between land ownership. So that's where I think financing actually, I know you didn't like urban planning, but spatial planning and land rights are really critical to land value and land-based financing for both cities, but also nature and forestry. So the value of land is often not managed or gained by the local authorities. The value created on land development is often goes to the private sector or private individuals. So how can regions better manage the land value that they do have? And then finally on biodiversity, obviously a lot of momentum now on biodiversity financing. We launched ourselves at the Local Climate Action Summit a new program on nature positive urban development. But I think, again, there are lots of financing instruments there, whether it's payment for ecosystem services, pledges, etc. But how does that really work on a regional scale? I think many of these things are on national level debt for nature swaps, for example, but how do we introduce those at a regional and local scale? So I will stop there, and thanks.
Great. Thank you very much, and great to see also the World Bank thinking about these innovative approaches and the regional scale. Yes. Thanks. Our next speaker is Helen Van Joy, and Helen works with WRI, and a lot of your work also links to some extent to UN Habitat, the cities work, your engagement in the 1000 Cities Adapt Now, which brings many partners together on building urban resilience to scale. So you have a wealth of knowledge in that space, but also around those partnerships. So tapping into that, what are the opportunities that you see for partnerships and integrated approaches across the scales?
Thank you, Bernard, and thank you again for the invitation to come and speak here. And I think just starting from a partnerships perspective is to say one of the biggest opportunity is that work is already happening within the local community. So if we're starting at different scales, at the local community level, really amazing work is already happening. So we are not, I think my microphone keeps going on and off, and maybe let's switch. I hope this is better. Yes. Okay, so I see nodding heads. That's good. So as I was saying, we're not building on nothing. We are starting from local communities who are at the front line with these natural resources, the biodiversity we are talking about, who are already doing really great things. At global level, I think for all of us that have been here at COP, we saw, as Jane alluded to, there's growing alignment around the need for multi-level action and a lot of partnerships, initiatives such as what UN Habitat led as the surge, seeing the urban ministerial happening a second year in a row and becoming institutionalized. I think there's a lot of exciting things that are happening there. But I have to say, when it comes to partnering, one of the things we have to acknowledge is that partnership and partnering is hard work and requires a lot of resources. It's easier in a lot of cases, it's easier said than done, particularly when it's around shared resources. There's a real risk of fatigue. There's a real risk of political interference, particularly when we touch on nature. And I think part of the things that it requires beyond what we do within our spaces, of course, for city regions, strong political will, but really meaningful intention to meaningfully engage. And what does that mean? It means that the level and scale of partnership must have mutual benefit to whichever scale, to the local communities, but also to the city governments. Part of the work we've been doing, for instance, around the shared resources, the work that we're doing with you around the Nairobi rivers, basin, where we're looking at a basin that's a shared resource across different counties, different cities, the capital city of Nairobi, and even secondary cities upstream and downstream. And I know, the land use term has now just been banned on stage, but that critical, tool of land relationship planning, I really like that, and in some cases harmonizing some legislation then become tools that allow us to partner really great. And I think the last thing I wanted to say is to ensure that we partner right, we must be intentional about seeking the right partners and partnering around the right areas. So the areas within which both levels of partners intend to strategically engage, and then we will be able to scale impact. I think I'll leave it there, Bernard. Thank you.
All right. Great. Thank you very much. Paul, over to you. You are the Associate Director of Urban Systems Center at ICLE Africa. And I think that in itself is already enough to introduce your intervention here. you probably have now the challenging task to connect all of this in terms of the systems thinking that many of us have already mentioned. Over to you in terms of your thoughts on how to connect everything.
Thanks, Bernard, very much, and thanks for offering me some time to reflect on this work. I'm part of ICLEI, and ICLEI's main responsibility in platforms such as the COP and other global and regional meetings is to bring the subnational and local voice here. So we've been at every COP, and again, sharing the successes of the second ministerial in a row. And we've seen this massive groundswell in appreciation of the need to focus on local governance, on urban and urbanization trends. So that's really, really promising and exciting. And I think if that's our baseline, we're seeing a lot of sustainability issues go from this sort of linear process to this exponential realization of solutions. So as much as we sometimes feel we're talking, I feel a lot of things are crystallizing at the moment. So I might go back to Aruma's provocation in the beginning that most of these issues are about governance. And I think when it comes to talking about cities, there are so many layers of systems, so many layers of people responsible for shaping those systems. And if we step back and think of our own expertise, we have the technical solves to many of these. But there are whole layers of politics, working with different partners, working with different government entities. And if I think of the work that we're focusing on at the Urban Systems Unit, it's how are we equipping local government politicians and technical officers with the system skills to navigate these many layers in cities. And as we all know, that's incredibly difficult work to do. My entry point into it comes maybe back to the provocation. Okay, if we're going to measure the keystone species and people, how? You know, and I think we use so many proxies in the way that we measure how cities work at the moment. We rely on outdated data, and we don't focus properly on the stuff of our cities. So the concept that I was invited to chat about today was urban metabolism, which is really how are we taking resources typically from a local or global environment, processing them, digesting them, metabolizing them for economic development and hopefully social outcomes as well. And then we see in cities that the waste just get dumped in the surrounding area. And to analyze an urban metabolism, we need a huge amount of data. And cities are not collecting this. And so when we are trying to think about our progress towards sustainability, we don't have any data to actually say whether or not we're succeeding. And so that's the provocation that I'm arriving in cities with our unit and trying to say, well, how can we measure this? How do we partner with research organizations to track food flows through city, to understand where water is moving and lost, to understand where the construction materials are coming from, what industrial materials are coming into cities. And we're not sure at all. But the minute you start to get flows of resources documented, the governance of cities becomes easier because you can suddenly identify where touch points for intervention can be. Rio de Janeiro was on a panel 2 days ago saying, it's amazing, we've got a food flow study and now we know how to intervene. And so equipping officials with these data is vital. Investing in capacities of students to be interested in material sciences, to be interested in circular economy or tracking is vital. And embedding this as a requirement of how you build cities is really important. I had another provocation which has just left me. But I think the more information that we are making available, even if we don't yet know what it's going to be for, the more we offer people an opportunity to make informed decisions. I remembered it was finance. The thing that is giving me the biggest quandary in the last year is about how we tend to finance, just like how we tend to run projects, a specific project in a specific sector. And even though we're systems thinkers and we're trying to build data to show the interactions and integrated land use, land relation planning, we're not financing that yet. And so the provocation I want to work on next year is how do we invest in multiple parts of the system so that our investment in one part, even though that's great, doesn't result in a systems failure and ruin that broader intervention. I don't think I shared that as eloquently as I thought I would, but how do we intervene in the community awareness for separation of waste, as well as the waste treatment plant? Because if you invest in just one of those, nothing's going to happen. Something like that. I'll pause there.
All right. No, thank you very much. And lots of provocations. I hope that has triggered some of your questions. So I'll open the floor. We have about anyone who wants to kick us off. Serene. Serene, I think there's an online version. So,
thank you so much. Yeah, what are your 30 by 30 aspirations? What do you think can the COP process here can accelerate that discussion for the CBD 30 by 30 goal? Just would love to hear your insight. Thank you so much.
I'm happy to jump. Oh, it's on. Okay, yeah, I'm happy to jump in. So I would say a couple of things off the bat. So one, on multi-level action, already mentioned not only subnational governments of local and regional, provincial, state, also indigenous nations, and also how about representatives of future generations and of nature. So that's one thing, and making that quite explicit so that we're not only taking into account short-term needs, because we don't have accountabilities to future generations or to nature or to biodiversity built into our institutions now. So how can we build in accountabilities? So that's one. I would say also specifically at bioregional as a critical scale of intervention. And bioregional, not only as they're construed now, but also will need to move to city bioregional boundaries, which will actually involve overlapping boundaries. So not only tight political boundaries, but we need to have natural ecosystems that are also taken into account, because right now we don't account for stewardship of bioregions and how that will need to be overlapping. So that's going to require different governance mechanisms, and then design of other governance mechanisms, from carbon treasuries to material registries, et cetera, on that scale of the bioregion. Those are a few initial thoughts.
Aruba's got his hand up.
Aro, over to you.
Just quickly on this is a very, it's an important question. It's also going to be a very tricky question in some senses. Because as we enter into 1.5, 2 degrees overshoot, there's going to be tremendous pressure on carbon dioxide removal. And at the moment, the only viable technologies or technological regimes that we have on CDR is sort of forestation, reforestation, maybe soil carbon. And that is going to be both a political and ecological crisis in many parts of the world. It'll confront 30 by 30 quite strongly. And I think we need much better science and a lot of interesting innovations on governance. You can't do CDR at that scale and keep sort of bioregional integrity unless you're able to address questions of water at transboundary scale. And we know that that's kind of we're at the tipping points as far as water is concerned. And we have no agreements. In fact, we have almost no diplomacy that looks at transboundary movements of water, because in a sense that's just one of the limiting factors. So I think this is an area in which we need to really push the boundaries, and there's going to be, I would say, interesting dialogue, if not conflict, between the communities on trying to deal with this question.
Thanks, Aro. I think anyone else wants to come in on that one? Good. Thanks. Any other questions from the floor? Yes.
Thank you for a great panel. Just wondering if you listen to cities, they're sometimes struggling to make a plan, an emission inventory to do the reporting. If you look at the systemic approach and the integrated approach, where do you propose cities to start? Knowing that if you look at a regional aspect, an urban metabolism, if you look at a systems integrated approach, how do you go to a more holistic vision, knowing that today is already difficult to get just the data, the overview, and also how to build the partnerships that are needed to move forward?
I've got some volunteers for that.
So it was a very good moment about 2 years ago after trying to talk to a number of cities about whether or not they collect biomass data, construction or industrial data, and they said no, and we have no intention of starting. And it's exact point. They don't have the resources to track this. They don't want yet another reporting burden. They've got to report to the international conventions they've signed to national government and all sorts. So the realization there is that partnership then, and as much as we're sick of using the partnership word loosely, is the only way we're going to get these data. And the trick there is, how do we standardize these? How do we set up a convention about the type of units that we're looking for, the type of methodologies that are going to be appropriate? And then equip university partners. Universities, there are many universities or research institutions within any local government. And so equipping individuals there with better access into those local governance systems and getting MOUs set up that they can be then partners in producing research that has an end user in mind. I have a big tension between producing research that is separate from how cities actually work. I mean, you know, it's really difficult. So I think the work in setting up institutional frameworks that invite that type of research with an expectation that it's going to be looked at and it's got to be something robust enough that the city can be proud of.
I'm glad that you raised climate action plans, because I think they are a very important tool at the local level to have this kind of integrated discussion. Usually they're often prepared by the climate department in a city, but many of the actions are by other parts of the city, whether it's transport, energy, the utility. I think nature and land doesn't feature yet very strongly in climate change action plans. Of course, usually adaptation is there, but not biodiversity and land management, I think. So I would imagine that's going to start evolving and coming on. But from our side, I do see climate action plans playing a bigger role than they have in the past and being an important tool. Yeah.
Thanks, and I'll just build on that. Thanks, Joanna. Really appreciate the question, Jorn. Thanks for that. Again, there's a lot of governance and institutional design that comes into play here. So I think there's also an opportunity for different kinds of currency design around this, including biodiversity credits, right? Because there's a whole lot of value creation that actually happens at local level, but is not harnessed in our current financial systems. So biodiversity credits, I think, is going to be a growing mechanism, hopefully by the next COP. That's already being tested out in many more places. One other aspect is in terms of value uplift that often isn't captured, right? There is immense public investment that goes into, one example that we studied at Dark Matter Labs was the High Line in New York, and how there was public investment that went into that, and there was immense value uplift in all of the surrounding private properties. And what we calculated was, if we had just measured the value uplift in the land surrounding the High Line, the entire High Line could have been paid for in just 10 months. So that's just one example where public investment very often results in private gain, and we need to absolutely change that. So how is value being created, and how are local and regional governments able to benefit from that in terms of transformational design and processes for public good outcomes?
I think let me also jump in there. Just say, I think going back to what Paul said, I think at the end of the day, partnerships will be the only key thing that would be able to elevate cities that are unable to be able to do some of these things. And I think some of the really important things is when we say data, data exists. But in a lot of cities, it's scattered across, either silos within city institutions themselves or city region institutions, or again, there's a sense of looking down upon data that perhaps local communities have, universities have. But then also, I think it comes to the justice element where countries, I think, that are developed do need to take a responsibility in being able to uplift the others and giving them the capacity and enablement that will allow them to be able to develop some of these things. So I think the discussion around a shift in power and the common but differentiated, responsibility is really critical and cannot be overlooked in that particular debate. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much. And nobody is signaling me that we, but I think you are nodding. Good. Because we started late, but we are 2 minutes over time. But then let me try to do the impossible to wrap up this session with a little bit of a summary, but really more reflecting on some of the key points. We've asked you already to look at a very complex connection, climate change, biodiversity, and land. We've asked you then to provide your thoughts on institutions, on finance, on partnership and systems. And obviously that makes this very complex. All of you have really highlighted not just the city-region dimension, which was integrated into the overall question or the framing of the session, but you took it, of course, immediately to the governance dimension as well, and the policy dimensions of this, and all of the key points that need to tie this together in terms of the measurements, the data, and so on. So I think we've brought out really the richness of this conversation, but I think we also managed to challenge ourselves, bring out new thinking, identify a number of entry points, and I think that's critical for us to take that forward. And that doesn't necessarily have to be the one entry point that works for every city or that works in every different region. If that is climate change action planning in one context, or biodiversity thinking, or land management and planning, urban or spatial, or whatever it is. But I think collectively, again, we've confirmed that integrated approaches are critical. It's not very useful to think only biodiversity, only climate change. Many of you brought out poverty, really the fundamentals of development, and connecting the dots are critical. I think for us collectively to tease out a little bit more the easy entry points, the low-hanging fruits that can work us then through the bigger systems will be the next step, and looking forward to working with all of you in the future on that. Last but not least, thanks to the hosts of this event. The time is up. If I want to thank the organizers.